Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we're going to be taking a look at more general weapons building overall, how to end up with something good, and a few tips and tricks along the way, starting with a neat one to get you going. Have you ever tried building a weapon from the preset creator, but it won't fit together because there's not enough room around it in the stash? This is one of the more annoying things about the gun builder because it removes the parts first sometimes, and even that process can block the rebuild of the weapon after. However, what we can do here is press tab, go into the inventory and shift stuff around until the gun is in a place where it's going to work, and bam, press escape, takes us right back to the preset builder, no need to save it and close with a preset, fiddle about, reload the profile, etc. So how do we go about building our weapons in the first place and coming up with something good? Like everything, modding weapons in EFT gets easier over time and the more that you do it, but when you start or you're still in the process of learning, it can be a complicated interplay of a few factors. Firstly, we have the basic weapon stats themselves, primarily centered around recoil versus ergonomics, and unhelpfully these numbers aren't comparable from weapon to weapon because of differences in how each weapon handles regarding recoil, and then the weight of each weapon, which contributes towards the same factors that ergonomics does, which is primarily ADS speed, but also sound made and arm stamina too. We then have to think about these stats versus price, which depends on the flea market with its own moving prices based on player supply and demand, as well as static trader prices. Traders introduce our trader level as a factor, as well as both quest unlocks and global limits as to whether you can even buy an item that you have technically got unlocked in the first place. As anyone who has spent some time modding in EFT will know, weapons in Tarkov are structured like a tree of parts, starting with that red weapon lower that you see on Fence all the time, and branching out as we add pieces of the build. This fundamental lower section is the container for the weapon's core stats, such as what the gun actually is, and everything that goes along with it, such as fire rate and base recoil, as well as durability for the purposes of weapons malfunctions. Then, everything else attaches to this. Before we can effectively use the weapons preset builder system, firstly you need to have the workbench level 1 to unlock it. Then you'll need to have any of the parts that you want to use identified so that they show up here at all. Before trying to mod a weapon, I strongly advise identifying as much as you can for that gun and others using the flea market, making ample use of the linked search to peel through the layers and find the available pieces, which shows you the parts that are either one layer up or one layer down in the modding tree. What I usually find instructive is to start with the minimum recoil for any particular weapon. This tells you the limit of what is possible and gives you good practice of knowing which parts are the best on different guns. Usually only a specific subset of attachments have really good recoil bonuses on them, and given recoil is typically more important, it's generally better to start here than with ergonomics most of the time. The best in slot attachments will change from weapon to weapon, but you'll see certain mods appearing over and over again, such as the RK2 foregrip, which is the only one with 4% recoil reduction, and the PRS Gen 3 stock, which often features as the most recoil reducing stock across many weapons. For most guns, you should be able to go through from the lower and add the most reducing part to get you to the lowest recoil, although there are some quirks, for example the muzzles, where you need a combination of two parts where it's slightly less clear cut. Once we have a low recoil build, we can then start to optimize the parts that give the best trade-off of more ergonomics for only a few points of recoil. The easiest example is almost always to switch from the RK2 to pretty much anything else, and you can see why many players use the RVG from Peacekeeper 3 for example, as you don't give up much recoil to get a lot of ergonomics back. This is even more important when suppressed, as the ergo of the gun will start struggling, so the reasons to bring it back elsewhere are more compelling. But how much ergo do you actually need? This question is hard to answer as it's partly down to personal preference and also depends on the weapon. I've been using the SVD recently, and despite trying to use an ergo-centric build with middling recoil, although you have a bit better arm stamina and ADS speed, it's still not fantastic because the gun is simply too heavy to make it great. Given that you pretty much need 2 shots to kill anyone wearing class 4 and above with any of the 7.62 54R rounds, the ability to take follow-up shots with lower recoil in my experience counters the lack of ergonomics overall. If you're fighting at 0 to 10 meters, often point shooting is the best option with a bit of practice, so it's the 10 to 50 meter range where I would argue that ergonomics matters the most. It's not a sniping range, but not too far so that you do have to ADS. Typically players at this distance see each other at the same time, and often the battle comes down to who gets off the first shot. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is to play around with the different ergo levels for the weapon that you want to use, feel the ADS speed practically, and decide if it's going to be fast enough or get you killed for whatever you want to get done with it. Taking that a bit further, a few offline factory raids can give you a better idea in reality to see how it actually handles. I've been back on modding the M4 recently, and the tipping point for me seems to be around 50 ergonomics. Lower than this and you can really start to feel it, higher than this and you don't get much for your money, or the recoil sacrifices that you have to make are too much. When adding an attachment, you can see the change in stats that it applies in recoil points, but not the actual stats of the attachment itself, which is kind of annoying. As a reminder, if an attachment says 1% recoil reduction for example, this will apply to the base recoil, i.e. the weapon with just the lower and nothing else on it. You can find this number easily by selecting New Preset in the Weapons Builder, which strips down the weapon as much as possible. If this number here is say 200, then the recoil reduction in recoil points for a 1% reducing attachment would be 2. It doesn't matter how many mods you have on, a 1% change from an attachment will still reduce 2 recoil in this example. This is why mods become more valuable in some way the more that you add together. Going from 155 to 145 recoil matters much less than going from 45 to 35. Also, as I've discussed previously in many other videos, this is the reason why weapons with fixed unchangeable stocks don't really benefit from recoil reducing attachments anywhere near as much as usual weapons. This is because the recoil reducing bonuses that you would normally see on a weapon like the M4 are already baked into the base recoil on a gun like the MDR, diminishing the value you get from recoil reducing mods significantly. To see the actual stats of the attachments, you'll need to go to Find Parts, which lets you double click on the components, but only if they are available to buy. Another thing that you might want to consider doing here is removing owner type traders from the filters. By setting this to any and checking the box at the bottom which says remember selected filter, this will now save forevermore. The preset filters are separate to your regular flea market filters, so it won't override anything there and just preserves it for this window, which is pretty handy. Honestly, I've been unchecking that trader only box manually for, well, until about a week ago when I wrote this script, so there you go, we learn something new every day. One thing to watch out for though is that if the trader is out of stock or you haven't unlocked the item yet, defaulting to the flea can be very expensive, so just be careful and don't go on autopilot clicking buy all before checking exactly how much each piece costs. One final thing before we leave this screen, you also have to be a bit careful with buying here in general. I'd always advise buying your parts from the assemble screen instead because it's much smarter in terms of what you do and don't need based on what you actually have in your stash. In the Find Parts window, you can see that it looks for a weapon and then also a barrel, but the gun has a barrel in it already, so you'd end up with 2 barrels if you bought it here. This is often why I look for prices for the base weapon separately, then I uncheck the parts that I will get with the base weapon when I'm modding just to see what the mod cost is and then add the original cost of the weapon back on top. In the Find Parts screen, you also can't be as selective about what base weapon you pick, either for durability or starting attachments such as barrel length that can save you a lot of money by picking the one you want to use at the start. Once we've done all this, we can tweak the low recoil builds based on what we want to end up with. Some weapons aren't purely linear like the SVD, so imagine the tree of possible builds forking somewhere and you have some components that only work on one branch and some only on the other. When looking for particular parts, you can check the whole category for the cheapest possible. Unfortunately, you can't put filters on stats like recoil or ergo, which would be amazing to have, being able to linked search for all foregrips with 2% recoil or better, for example. But anyway, the bad ones are usually cheap, so normally you can whiz through the lower section looking for better items to appear in the list and grab some good ones. For example, if we want to get a cheap scope, you can check which of the ACOG style optics are the cheapest by searching the compact mount on the linked search. This means that you don't have to check each one individually if you don't really care about which one you want to buy. Most of the parts that we need to make decent builds are found at traders level 2, 3 and 4. When making my own builds, I pretty much always swap out the RK2 for another foregrip. The negative ergo for me just isn't worth the 4% recoil reduction that you get from it. As I mentioned earlier, at Peacekeeper 3, you can see why so many people swear by the RVG Black foregrip, as it's relatively cheap and either outperforms or is very close to the other best foregrips. There are only 3 foregrips in total that provide 3% recoil reduction, and they're either expensive, only give a few points of ergo, or both. If you have an M-LOK handguard, the M-LOK AFGs have the same stats without the need for a rail, which is kinda cool. For the AKs, you can swap out the stocks for either one of the fixed ones or the folding ones depending on which variant you have, but unless making something heavily modded, usually just adding the butt pad to the base stock is perfectly fine for value builds. You don't get that many more stats from the best in slot stocks, and what you do get is primarily ergo focused. With the AKs, you can make some very efficient unsuppressed builds given the RRD muzzle is so good, which means you don't need the ergo to counterbalance the suppressor, which is really when I would consider them more strongly. Most of the time, all you have to do with the AKs is add the pad, a muzzle, and swap the handguard for something with a 2% recoil bonus like the CAA and add the Bastion. Once you have Mechanic 3, the RRD is cheap and it also fits on the 7.62 AKs as well with the Tactica Tula mount. 7.62 does have its own version of the RRD, but at Mechanic 4 this takes a lot longer to unlock, even though it is slightly better. Moving on to the M4 and similar, these are typically a bit more complicated to put together. The M4 itself is a bit of a special case because it's so flexible, and I usually make mine by starting with an ADAR from the Flea and an M4 lower from Mechanic 2, as it's pretty much always cheaper than buying the barrel, upper and tube separately or buying a default M4 on the Flea for the same stats. The most recoil reducing parts for the M4 are locked to level 4 traders, namely the Altor upper, the advanced tube and the 20-inch barrel, which are the parts that can get you into seriously low recoil territory. But at Peacekeeper 3, we get access to the MOE stocks and pad, which are only a fraction worse than the PRS on recoil and give a ton of ergo in comparison. This combo is amazing value, and I use it on nearly everything that it's compatible with. The Mark 10 handguard is another decent pickup for Mechanic 3, now that the rail is at the same level too, and is one of the only 2 handguards on the M4 platform with 3% recoil reduction. There are a few others that you could use with a 2% that give us a little bit better ergonomics that can be compelling, given we typically use M4 suppressed and they are fairly cheap like the Geissele on the Flea sometimes. We almost always use the M4 suppressed because of the significant outperformance of the compensator suppressor muzzle combo versus the standalone muzzles on the AR-15 barrels. This is very different to the way the AKs end up working in the game. We can use the same tactic we used before to link search on the upper this time to find a decent handguard that fits, but you have to be aware that not every handguard fits to every layout of barrel length and gas tube, so make sure it's possible in your build first before you purchase the item. Without at least Peacekeeper 3, it is hard to make a good M4 build, and a budget-ish build with the Knight's Armament suppressor, which is relatively cost effective at 30k, you're looking at around the 50-ish recoil range. These days, with M4's 800 RPM fire rate in 12-12, this can feel quite rough, but I've been having some great success with 5.56 recently using semi-auto as my default and full auto much more selectively in buildings and tight areas. I believe that if you change your playstyle a little bit in 12-12, you can actually end up performing really well with some of the similar builds before, you just need to use them in a slightly different way. So overall, the process comes down to finding the best recoil builds first, then tweaking them down to something sensible. Find parts where giving up a few recoil points gets you a lot of ergonomics, but also doesn't cost too much, which depends on what you have available from the traders. You can start to mod for stats right from the word go, but for the money and the way Tarkov's recoil system is set up, you tend to get the best value for intermediate builds when stacking 4 to 5 efficient parts together and benefiting from the collective stat improvement that they all give at the same time. So as usual, if you learned something, please consider dropping a like and a comment. To see when I'm streaming, you can follow me on Twitter and Twitch. Check out our Scav Talk podcast in the links below, and with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.